people like me. You need people like me so you can point your fucking fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure that most of you have heard by now. The Saudis are planning a big heavyweight card December 23rd, and I remember immediately after the Fury versus Ngannou fight, there was talk of Francis Ngannou returning to the ring on December 23rd for one more boxing match. Perhaps there has been a change in plans, as he's now saying that his focus is to get a rematch with Tyson Fury, so perhaps he won't be boxing in December, but these guys will. Anthony Joshua versus Otto Wallin, Deontay Wilder versus Joseph Parker, Dimitri Bivol versus Richard Riviera, Daniel Dubois versus an opponent that has yet to be announced, and Martin Bakole versus an opponent that has yet to be announced. Addressing some of the rumored names set to make an appearance on this card that have not been officially named yet, Jarrell Big Baby Miller was dropping hints via his social media, his Instagram, that he may be boxing on this show. There's also a rumor that Michael Hunter might be fighting on this same show. So maybe what we get, if everything goes to plan, is Martin Bakole versus Michael Hunter 2, their rematch. You may recall that Michael Hunter gave Martin Bakole his first professional loss several years ago. This would be Martin's chance to run it back and pay him back. So maybe we get Bakole versus Hunter 2, and maybe Daniel Dubois shares the ring with Jarrell Big Baby Miller. Jarrell is dropping hints that he's going to fight on this card. Maybe it's going to be against Daniel, who's on the rebound after having been stopped by Alexander Usyk. That might be how it all breaks down, but there are some logistics issues to be addressed, enough of them that you might want to curb your enthusiasm. They want Deontay Wilder to box on this show, but Deontay Wilder, in his own words, stated that he's looking to come back in mid-January, and it just so happens that TGB, which is just another way of saying PBC, they have a fight date penciled in for mid-January. That's when Wilder said he'd be coming back. So the question is, what will Wilder decide to do? Will he decide to box in Saudi on this show, or will he proceed with the plan to box on that TGB show, if he is going to box on that TGB show, in January? The fight in December is supposed to be against Joseph Parker, whereas I think the fight in January, if he were to fight in January, I think that would be the Andy Ruiz fight. Which fight on which show gets Wilder more money? The whole thing feels a little impromptu because it was just a few days ago that Wilder himself was talking to Ali Sekbak and detailing a January return. Then this news breaks, this news hits that he might come back sooner than that. I feel like the Saudis are reaching out to as many big names at heavyweight as they can, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they will all participate. This is what I mean when I say that there are logistics issues. You're talking about Anthony Joshua, who boxes exclusively on DAZN, and Daniel Dubois, who boxes exclusively on TNT, fighting on the same show. Well, who's going to be the UK broadcaster? Who's going to be the US broadcaster? Who's going to be at the helm of the promotion? What about Wilder? Who's he with? Is he with anybody? I can only deduce that after Tyson Fury completely bombed at the box office opposite the ring, Francis Ngannou embarrassed himself and embarrassed the sport and lost a lot of people a lot of money. The Saudis are deciding to bring out the big guns. Oh, I know that money is no object to these people, but I also know that they didn't put that entire show together just for it to flop as bad as it flopped. For what they paid Tyson Fury, and what they paid Francis Ngannou, and what they paid all that boxing royalty to be there in attendance for that weekend, just for it to sell well under 100,000 in America, and I think 400,000 overall, 400,000 pay-per-views sold globally, that's nothing. That's a complete loss. And while I don't think that money
is any object to these people. I reiterate, I also don't think they put that show together with the hopes that it would flop.
Services is yet another glaring example of what I've been telling you all along. Remember, it was Tyson Fury and Frank Warren carrying on about how Eddie Hearn and AJ are now frozen out of Saudi.
Oh, really?
Not according to this. According to this, Anthony Joshua has the option to return to the ring at least one more time before this year is out on the Saudis' dime. So what happened to that narrative? I'll tell you what happened. Tyson Fury, once again, bombed at the box office, and the Saudis need someone with real drawing power who can generate money. And that's Anthony Joshua. That's why Anthony's on the Forbes list and Tyson Fury isn't.
But I reiterate, we do have to curb our enthusiasm. These are the guys the Saudis want to make an appearance on their December 23rd show, but that doesn't mean that all of them will participate. There are logistics issues there.
Don't forget they're talking about putting Dimitri Bivol on this thing, so you've got at least two Matchroom fighters in Anthony Joshua and Dimitri Bivol, a boxer fighter in Martin Bakole,
Queensbury Promotions fighter in Daniel Dubois, and a PBC guy in Deontay Wilder. And who's going to be the broadcaster for this thing? Who's going to promote it?
I actually like these matchups, and I like the sound of the card. And if it comes into fruition and they bill it as a pay-per-view, I would say that this much talent on one show is pay-per-view worthy. So if they do it, I'll buy it. But it seems almost too good to be true. Some are complaining that, well, Anthony and Wilder, they're not fighting each other. They're fighting in separate fights, though all the same. Wilder versus Parker is a decent-looking scrap. And so is Anthony Joshua versus Otto Wallin.
You may recall in previous videos I've talked about the merits of that fight, Joshua versus Wallin. How Otto Wallin looked like a world beater opposite the ring Tyson Fury, and that's really the only time he's ever looked that aggressive and that strong and that come forward. Every other fight he's more of a boxer than a puncher, but with Fury.
That's not saying I don't think Otto is a good fighter, because I do think he's a good fighter, though more often than not, he's more of a cerebral fighter. More often than not, he's a boxer more than a puncher, and with Tyson Fury, he broke character and to some, came very close to shocking the world. So what message would it send Anthony Joshua's critics if he went in there with that same Otto Wallin and took care of him more handily than Tyson Fury did? If he goes in there and beats him without laboring, like Fury had to labor, like Fury had to struggle, sends quite the message. I like these matchups. I like Wilder versus Parker.
I remember several years ago when they were both unbeaten champions at the same time, when Joseph still had the WBO and Deontay still had the WBC. There were preliminary talks about potentially doing a fight between them. You know, Joseph Parker, he was in attendance for one of Wilder's fights. I forget which one, though nothing ever materialized.
A lot has happened since then. Since then, Deontay Wilder has made his old buddy Malik Scotch his head trainer and sacked Mark Breland. Since then, Joseph Parker, he's swapped out Kevin Barry for Andy Lee. He's with Andy Lee now. Joseph Parker is coming off of 2 consecutive victories since having been stopped for the very first time in his career by Joe Joyce. He's coming off a win over Jack Macy and a more recent win, not but a few weeks ago, on the undercard of Fury versus Ngannou over Simon Keane of Canada. And I have to admit that Joseph did look the part opposite the ring Simon Keane. The difference in experience, Joseph's shot selection, what punches he threw, when he threw them, and where he threw them, the shortness of those punches and how they were defensible shots as opposed
to what you saw from Simon Keane, the much greener fighter of the two, very tall, physically imposing fighter fighting out of a wide stance. Not very good for a fighter's balance.
He was noticeably taller, longer than Joseph Parker, took up more space, but he was fighting out of a wide stance. A tall guy fighting out of a wide stance like that, it leaves you off balance. You're not in optimal position to move or optimal position to punch, but that's how he was fighting, and you know he paid for it. Joseph Parker landed a peach of an uppercut, mid-range to inside, and took Simon Keane out. It seems that enlisting the aid of Andy Lee has breathed new life into Joseph Parker's career. People tend to forget that Joseph, even though he's been around a long while, he's not an old guy.
He's only 31 years old. It feels like he's been around forever, but he's actually younger than Deontay, much younger than Deontay, and Tyson Fury, and Usyk, and AJ. He's the youngest of the lot of them.
But very much experienced, just as experienced as Deontay Wilder, who the Saudis want him to fight on December 23rd. Joseph Parker has boxed in the last 12 months. Deontay Wilder, he hasn't, and he is the older fighter by some years.
You say that? Yeah, Joseph Parker, he's been knocked out before. He got knocked out by Joe Joyce, so who's to say Wilder doesn't knock him out? Need I remind you, Joe Joyce is not a carbon copy of Deontay Wilder. They're very different fighters.
Joe Joyce is a mid-range to inside pressure fighter, volume puncher, whereas Deontay is more akin to hanging back and setting up the big right hand, setting up a big counter right to knock the other guy out. The entirety of a round, Deontay's looking to land one punch, a single shot, whereas Joe is a more prolific puncher, so he was able to wear down Joseph Parker
by bullying him and throwing punches in bunches. Wilder don't throw punches in bunches. He's always been an economic fighter.
It's a very different fight for Joseph than what he faced with Joe Joyce. Deontay Wilder, he's got two left feet, poor cardio, poor coordination, not much of a jab, and relies on a single punch, relies on a single right hand the entirety of a round. And this is a much older fighter than Joseph that hasn't boxed this entire calendar year, what has all the makings of an intriguing fight.
And I still have unanswered questions about Wilder's punch resistance, because the last time we saw him, he boxed for less than a round. He's boxed for less than a round in what? The last 2 years?
For me and my money, Wilder versus Parker is an intriguing fight, and so is Wilder versus Ruiz. I guess the biggest question, the most relevant one, is what fight pays out Wilder more money? The Parker fight in Saudi or the Ruiz fight in Las Vegas in January of next year?
As it pertains to Wilder versus Parker, it's definitely intriguing because Joseph Parker, he's got his drawbacks, but he also has his virtues. He is a more balanced fighter than Deontay Wilder. Better coordination, mid-range to inside. He's quite capable. He just has to get there.
And if he can, things can get interesting. He's not as slow on his feet as Andy Ruiz, and that's working for him. He has to mind Wilder's straight right hand. He'll be looking to set it up, and he'll be pumping out that jab, that lazy jab, that Joseph Parker can slip and counter over the top. That's what makes it intriguing. That Joseph isn't as slow on his feet as Andy Ruiz. He's been more active in the last 12 months, more active in the last calendar year, and he is a solid fighter. He still is a solid fighter, at least as solid as Andy Ruiz. So I like the Parker fight, though I do question as to whether or not Wilder will go through with it. Or is he too far along in the Andy Ruiz talks, assuming that's what he was referencing when he said he'd come back in January.
We have to see what Wilder will decide to do.
Now, as it pertains to Joshua versus Wallin, Otto Wallin, who a few weeks ago was ordered to face IBF interim champion Filip Hrgovic for a chance to become Alexander Usyk's mandatory challenger. It's safe to say that the Joshua fight in Saudi would pay him a lot more money than the Hrgovic fight, wherever that would go down. So I think that Otto would be receptive to fighting Anthony Joshua. I vaguely recall him expressing an interest in that fight. These two have history. They faced each other in the amateurs.
Anthony Joshua beat him, along with Zhilei Zhang. What do they have in common?
They're both statuesque southpaws, big ones, like Charles Martin, who Anthony Joshua beat for the IBF title way back there in 2017, I believe it was. Southpaws like Alexander Usyk, but not as nimble, not as light on their feet, not as crafty, not as fast. I like Anthony Joshua's chances against Otto Wallin, and there are redeeming qualities to the fight that you won't find everywhere. That Otto Wallin gave Tyson Fury all he could handle, and he really made him look bad. Otto Wallin, who's never been knocked out, not by Tyson Fury, not by nobody. He's never been stopped, and he's racked up a string of victories since dropping that decision to Fury.
He's coming off a points decision win over former champion Murat Gassiev not but a few weeks ago.
And he's a solid opponent, adaptable, cerebral when he needs to be, rough and rugged when he needs to be. You can't really critique and criticize this fight like the Jermaine Franklin fight. Jermaine Franklin, who was coming off a loss to Dillian White. You can't critique and criticize this fight like the Robert Helenius fight, what was a late replacement after Dillian White tested positive for a banned substance. I feel like the Wallin fight is a better and more intriguing fight than those fights were, and as stated, there are redeeming qualities to this match that if Anthony Joshua can stop Otto Wallin where Tyson Fury could not, that's really sending a message.
Now, I've already seen some gripes, some complaints, in some circles that they would prefer it's Wilder that Anthony fight in December, but it was Deontay Wilder before this news even broke that stated he would be returning in January. It was Wilder that stated that all is not lost for the Ruiz fight. So Wilder was already heading in a particular direction.
If everything goes to plan and the Saudis can actually pull this off, manage to get this many familiar faces on one show, that is encouraging towards a Joshua versus Wilder fight next year.
Renewed interest in doing it because remember, it was the Saudis that pulled the funding from that fight. I guess they saw what a massive flop Fury versus Ngannou was and decided to revisit this thing because they have a better chance of making money with this than they ended up making with that.
All of this in December would be an appetizer, a prelude to what could be Joshua versus Wilder, and of course, Fury versus Usyk. It's a step in the right direction if you can get both Anthony and Deontay to box on the same show along with everyone else, though as stated, there really are logistics issues. A lot of these guys are from different sides of the street, so you do have to wonder who's going to air this thing, who's going to broadcast it, who's going to broadcast it in America, in the UK, and all the other territories. These are important details that boxing fans don't often like to be bothered with.
But they matter. That's what tells you whether or not this thing can actually happen. How feasible is it?
How would Otto Wallin approach an Anthony Joshua fight? More often than not, he's a cerebral fighter, a boxer, a mover, a jabber, but we saw him break character with Tyson Fury in a way that he hasn't with other fighters. Would he do the same thing with Anthony Joshua? He does have a way of rising to the occasion. We know now not to underestimate him. At the same time, Anthony Joshua's got the kind of punching power, the kind of quality right hand.
Straight right hand, that's southpaw killer.
A straight right hand like the one that he landed on Robert Helenius earlier this year. If he were to land that same straight right hand on Otto Wallin, I don't think Otto keeps his footing. I don't think he can absorb a right hand like that from Anthony Joshua.
In fact, I don't think a lot of heavyweights can absorb a right hand like that one.
Not counting our chickens before they're hatched. If they were to fight, I get the sense that Otto Wallin would try to take it to Anthony the same way that he tried to take it to Tyson Fury, on the predication that some people think Anthony Joshua is chinny, that some people think he's fragile. All the while, he's only ever been knocked out once, whereas Deontay Wilder, he's been knocked out twice.
But it's Anthony they like to call chinny.
I feel like Otto would get aggressive with AJ the same way he did with Fury, and that would leave the door open for Anthony to land that mammoth right hand if the fight happens. We have to see if it does.
It's a good fight if they can make it happen.